Hello folks, and you're all very welcome along to another video from Gundog on Fly. Tá míle fáilte roimh. Now, this is the second part of, if you like, my beginners fly fishing series. And in the last video I spoke about rods and reels, and I had a fantastic response to the video. People said it was badly needed and words to that effect, and they really enjoyed it and found it helpful. Now, in this video I'm going to speak about another area of fly fishing that is very big really. So there's a likelihood that I'll leave some stuff out, and if I do, be sure to remind me in the comment section. But in the meantime, what I'm going to talk about fly lines and leaders and tippet. Now, fly lines. I'll just give you a very brief history lesson where fly lines are concerned. First fly line I ever had was, old stagers will know what I'm talking about. It was a Kingfisher silk line. Now, it wasn't a new line when I got it. It was worn out essentially, but it's the first fly line I ever had. And it was supposedly a floating fly line, but like all floating fly lines, it inevitably sank, and it sank most of the time. And what we used to do with those fly lines at that time, and this sounds really ancient, and I suppose it is really, we used to hang them out on the clothesline in an attempt to dry them out, and then we would apply huge amounts of various potions and to try and keep them afloat. They might float for a little while, but they inevitably sank, and they were very, very poor in terms of fly lines. Now, modern fly lines, of course, are a huge advance on that sort of stuff. There are just so many different types of fly lines. Floating fly lines, sink tip fly lines, full sinking fly lines, but then you have, within that range, you have a whole lot of fly lines that sink at different depths according to their weight and all kinds of technical stuff like that that we won't really go into here. But for a beginner, what sort of a fly line do you need? Now, if you're a beginner who's never taken any casting instruction and you're trying to learn on your own, well then what I suggest to you is that you buy the cheapest fly line you can find, because you're going to make absolute SH1T out of it while you're casting, because your casting technique won't be good and you will do all sorts of damage to the line, and you don't want to be spending too much on the line if that's the way it's going to be. But if you have practiced a little bit in casting and you're reasonably competent at it, well then, what kind of fly line do you need? What kind of fishing are you doing? And what I would recommend to any beginner would be to get a floating fly line. Now, the reasons for this are, a floating fly line is much easier to manage than, say, an intermediate, a sink tip, or a full sinker. Now, they all have their advantages in certain situations, but for the most part, like, I never fish with anything other than a floating line. I perhaps once in 5 years I might use a sink tip, but I just, across the board, I don't use them. I find them difficult to use because they're not as enjoyable to use as a floating line. A floating line, no matter how much of the line you have out, you can lift it immediately off the water, just like that. A sinking line or sink tip line or an intermediate, you have to draw it all the way in until such time as it's really close to you to begin casting again, because you can't lift it off the water because it's under the water. You have to pull it through the water, and they're not nice to use, they're not pleasurable to use. Now, they can be advantageous if you're fishing in high water. Sinking lines can be useful from the point of view you get down that bit deeper, and if you're fishing wet flies or some form of lure or whatever, you'll be able to get down that bit deeper and possibly catch a few more fish. But I would persist with my floating fly line. That's just the way it is. Now, within floating fly lines, you have different designs, we'll call them. Right? We have two principal designs. We have double taper, And what that means is that the line is fat in the middle and it gradually tapers out on both ends. Then you have wade forwards, which are used now by almost everyone I meet. They have a long, thin running line. Then you have a weighted part on the front of the fly line, hence the name wade forward. That has an advantage if you're casting long distances, because the weight will carry the line forward as you punch it through the air. I fish double tapers exclusively. I don't like, this is just a personal taste, I don't like wade forward lines. They tend to be splashy. I find that they're splashy, and I require delicacy for the kind of fishing I do. So I like double tapers. And then the advantage of the double taper, of course, is when you wear one end out, you can turn it around on the reel and then you can use the other end. So you have, we'll call it an economic advantage as well. So fly lines are made by numerous manufacturers and can cost you anything from €5 up to and including €200 and everywhere in between. And from my experience, and it's much like the rods, I suppose, in a sense, there's an awful lot of blurb about lines, like technical taper, technical this, technical that, tactical taper, tactical this. These are designed to get your money, basically. They don't mean a whole lot, you know. That's my view on it. Now, that mightn't suit some people, but that's the way I see it. Technical tapers and tactical tapers and all that kind of stuff, it's designed to sell stuff in my view. But anyway, that line on that reel there, which is, if you remember the last video, this is the rod and reel I use for 90% of the fishing that I do. That line's been on there 4 years. Now, I've had 4 seasons out of that line. It's starting to crack a bit now, right? So it'll probably need replacing soon. So it's getting a bit worn. But like 4 seasons, and I put them through their paces. 4 seasons is a long time to have a fly line. A lot of people would change their fly lines very regularly and would have all kinds of different fly lines on different reels for different purposes. But that fly line has seen a lot of water and a lot of days out, and it's still serviceable for another little while. And I paid €30 for that line. And the next line I buy, I won't be spending much more than that on it, because in my view, a floating fly line, they have the name floating fly line, is somewhat of a misnomer really, because no matter how much you spend on a floating fly line, it will at some point sink. That's my experience. I've fallen for the blurb down years ago, and I fell into the trap of the technical and the tactical, and I thought, yeah, this is the answer now, this one will float forever. But they don't. None of them ever do. They all inevitably sink. That's just the reality. They all inevitably sink. So I don't go out and spend €150 or 170 or €200 on a line because it says technical or tactical or whatever it is. I buy a double taper floating fly line for, not the cheapest, you can buy really, really cheap ones for 10, 15 euros, but they're plastic lines and they're rubbish. Somewhere between 30 and 50 euros is enough, in my view, to be spending on a fly line. Now that's my view on fly lines. Not everyone's going to agree on that, particularly the manufacturers of the technical and the tactical and all that. But that's my experience with fly lines. Other people have entirely different experiences, and maybe they could advise you better if you don't particularly agree with my view on fly lines. Now, I'm probably leaving out bits about fly lines, and like I said, you can remind me if there's aspects of it, or I don't like to punt particular brand names or anything like that. I'm not in the business of selling stuff for people. So I leave it to yourself. If you want to buy a fly line, my advice is to buy one for somewhere between €30 and maybe 50 to 60 maximum. And it'll serve you just fine if you look after it to some degree. I don't do a whole lot of look after them. I try not to stand on them, particularly if I'm on concrete. If I'm on a bridge, say, and I'm tackling up and getting ready, you don't want to stand on your line on concrete because you'll injure it and damage it, and it'll be a problem. It's not so big a problem if you stand on it in the field or on the bank of the river, but it's best to avoid standing on them. Looking after them, you can clean them, just a bit of washing up liquid and cotton wool, and just clean them off. That can help. If they're sinking persistently, you can revive them to a degree. So anyway, that's my view on fly lines, and now I'm going to talk to you about leaders and tippet. Leaders and tippet. Now, I hear you ask, what is the difference between a leader and a tippet? Well, they were all known one time as a cast. That's what it was known as. Leaders and tippets are relatively new terms to describe what was known as a cast, which is basically the material that you use, that you attach to your fly line, and then you attach your flies to that. They're known now as leaders and tippets. The leader is the overall length coming from your fly line to your fly or flies. That's your leader. A tippet, as I understand it, is the front part of that. The fine part at the front is the tippet. Now, much like fly lines, there's a huge array of manufacturers, and there's a huge range of products and materials and new innovations and all kinds of stuff, and here is just an example of some of them. Now, all of these I have tried at various times, and I've never got along with them, to be honest about it. They're all new materials. Fluorocarbon is one of them. I just couldn't get along with it. Maybe I'm just not clever enough. I don't know the right knots or whatever the case may be. I always found it very abrasive, and I just constantly breaking off on it and all that kind of stuff. So I abandoned fluorocarbon entirely. There was other new names and different designs and different technical and tactical and all that kind of stuff, much like the fly lines. And I tried various ones and I could never get along with them. Now, maybe you try them and you get along fine with them, but just for me, I use old-fashioned stuff that I've been using down through the years, and I always found it reliable. This here is Shakespeare Omni. Almost as old as myself, I'd say. And it's been around that long. But it served me well down through all those years. It's just nylon, that's all it is. Monofilament. And I use this for a lot of things. Like I use it mainly for nymphing. Upstream nymphing is one of my favourite ways to fish. And I just tie on basically a 10 or 12 foot length of this in whatever diameter I deem suitable at the time, and it just works for me. Another thing I use, and I use this as a sort of a system, it's the simplest system that I understand in terms of leaders and tippets. This here is a Maxima tapered leader. Now it's tapered, meaning that it's fat at one end and it gradually tapers to a point. You can buy them in different diameters. This happens to be 4.5 pounds break and strain at the point. Now there's an X system. I don't want to get too technical about all this, but there's an X system, I think, which was primarily designed by American fly manufacturers of monofilaments and stuff like that to delineate the sizes. So for instance, this is a 5X, which is, as I pointed out already, 4.5 pounds break and strain. A 6X is 3 pounds break and strain, and a 7X is 2.3 pounds break and strain. So the X system is, again, it's been around a long time in the US, I know, but it's only relatively recently been adopted by people here in Ireland, and I kind of have a very basic understanding of it, and I use it to a degree, but I tend to revert to the old school pounds breaking strain, because that's the way I best understand it. So this is a 5X, like I said, 4.5 pounds breaking strain. Is 12 feet long, and that's perfect. Just attach that to your fly line by methods which I'll show you in another video, and just go fishing. You can fish a single nymph, upstream nymph, spot a trout rising, nip it off, tie on your dry fly and continue, and then swap back immediately. No need for protracted tying on different types of leaders and all the rest of it. Just this one will do you just fine. And you can reduce the diameter of it when conditions get difficult in low water or periods of difficult fishing. You can reduce the diameter and maybe get better responses from fish. So that's just to give you some idea of what leaders and tippets are about. That's my understanding of it, and I have used, as I say, and that's only an example. That bunch there, that's just an example of some of the stuff. I've had people come to me and say, hey, listen, I found this new tippet, it's fantastic, blah. And I've tried them, and none of them have ever really worked out for me. So like I say, I just use the old style, and it works just fine for me, and it doesn't seem to matter whether there are no real advantages that I can see in any of the other materials. Now, there are other people that will point out to you numerous advantages, and but for me, there aren't any. So that's it, folks, on fly lines, leaders and tippets. I've no doubt left some stuff out, so jump into the comment section if you have any questions. And in the next video, which I'm really looking forward to making, I'm going to talk about flies. That's my favorite subject to talk about. I love talking about flies. I think I know a bit about flies. I just love flies, and I love all the stuff that goes on with it, people's favorites and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to go into it in quite some depth, so I'm really looking forward to making that video. And if you want to see that video, you might consider subscribing and hit the notification bell, and you'll be advised of when that video is uploaded, and you won't miss it. So in the meantime, thanks very much for joining me, and I hope to see you soon in the future. And you might consider also, I've left a link in the description to my Patreon page where you can make a small contribution to the channel, which would help it enormously. And Shin Shin, Oim Tranona, agus be me a kaint rishliv an céadúile, gur maithagaí as bhar chomhlóidir agus slán go fóil.